America's center of power changed, and with it, the dynamics of the political landscape. The consequences will reverberate locally, in Florida, on Capitol Hill, and on the global stage. Voters demanded change on the issues that mattered most: the economy, immigration, and social issues. Now, News4JAX goes beyond the headlines with political analysts who provide unique context and perspective. Experts focused on the issues making headlines. This is Politics and Power.
Let's talk about the politics of that big, beautiful bill the House passed. It is now in the Senate's hands. It is polarizing. It may not have an easy go in the upper chamber. Why? It may cost almost 9 million Americans their health care. It may add considerably to the national debt. Also on the agenda, remember when he was on the campaign trail, Donald Trump said he did not know a thing, anything about Project 2025. Well, look at the agenda that's in his big, beautiful bill and the proposals in Project 2025. Put them side by side. What the Heritage Foundation proposed to change the complexion of the federal government and what's on the table with that bill, they're too alike just to be a coincidence. Welcome to Politics and Power. Bruce Hamilton, and joining me, political analyst Daniel Cronrath. Good to have you here.
Thanks, Bruce. Thanks for having me back.
Always. So, Daniel, political analysts say if you look at that big, beautiful bill closely, it delivers on President Trump's domestic agenda. It cuts taxes, but exacts quite a cost. It may, in fact, cost 8.6 million Americans their health care coverage through Medicaid or Obamacare subsidies, and others facing higher premiums and out-of-pocket costs. Is Donald Trump asking Republicans to support a bill without coming up with a decent argument why it's worth making life worse for millions of aging, unemployed, working poor, or disabled Americans?
Well, yeah, Bruce, and thanks for asking. It's an important question, particularly if you're one of these millions of Americans who are going to be looking at losing their health care. The first thing I would say is I think that 9 million estimate that you put out is a little bit conservative. Some groups have said that it could be up to 12 or 13 million Americans who are going to be losing access to Medicaid. The other thing which I think is important to note is you'll recall during his campaign, President Trump said that he would not be approving cuts to Medicare and to Social Security. However, it's very important to note, as most of us do know, that a lot of older Americans who receive Medicare also receive Medicaid. Medicaid fills in the gaps for their Medicare coverage that if you can't afford a Medicare Part C Advantage plan to cover things like your vision, your dental and hearing, a lot of seniors in the United States, folks who have paid into Medicare for their entire lives, depend upon those Medicaid supplements in order to help meet their most basic needs. When Medicare was set up, Bruce, and of course it's a program that is a non-means tested program, meaning that every American, regardless of your wealth, gets to enjoy the benefits of Medicare if you have paid into the program. The three things that seniors struggle with as they get older, Bruce, and where their health care begins to deteriorate is through their eyes, through their ears, and especially through their mouth, through their teeth. So when we're thinking about that Medicaid coverage and that assistance, we're not just thinking about children, which is what primarily in widowed women who Medicaid was set up to initially help in the United States when it was established, but we're also just thinking about those people who you may know in your life, who you see every day, the people who might be working part-time at Publix right now, who are assisting you as your cashier or your bagger, who are getting Medicare, who are relying on Medicaid, or maybe, Bruce, when they finally have to leave that Publix or Winn-Dixie job, they're going to lose their Medicaid, or they're going to need that Medicaid because they're not making enough right now, and then what's going to happen to these folks? Your question about the political toll, which is this is going to take on the president. I think that a lot of senators, unlike the House, who of course they were able to get this through with one vote, and we know that they're using budget reconciliation, which is a way which you can avoid the filibuster in the Senate, because let's be quite frank about this, Bruce, in the 53-47 Senate, with some of the folks that we were going to talk about later today who are not on board with this would not pass normal business in the Senate. It would not get through, would not survive a filibuster, which is why they're using the reconciliation technique. These red state senators, many of them are very, very aware of the fact, if you look at Mississippi, if you look at Alabama, if you look at some of the other states, West Virginia, Bruce, some of the highest poverty rates and highest uninsured rates in the country, this is going to disproportionately impact the folks who came out and voted overwhelmingly for Donald Trump. The last thing that I would say to answer this question, which I find really interesting, President Trump is the first president, the Republican president, in decades, since Ronald Reagan, who actually won the vote of people who make less than $50,000 a year. Okay? That was a core constituency in him being able to beat Hillary Clinton in 2016, but particularly beat Vice President Harris in 2024. These kinds of cuts to their core health care is going to be politically calamitous to them. And I think that you're going to see a lot of red state Republicans realize this, even if President Trump right now does not, because this is the nature of Washington, D.C. This is not unique to President Trump. President Trump wants a political victory in his first term. And regardless of the warts, regardless of the problems that we can talk about with this bill, from a purely politics and power perspective, Bruce, this does represent a political victory for the president if he's able to accomplish this legislation.
Right. And you brought up an interesting point. If you go to the grocery store, you find people who are working who never expected, at the age of 72, 74, 75, or even older to be back in the ranks of employment. And God forbid, if they need long-term health care, if they need to be in a nursing home, where they can't afford it.
We tell ourselves, Bruce, and we fancy this notion that there are seniors out there who are just bored now and no longer want to be retired. That, my friend, is not the case.
It is not the case.
That is not the case. We have people, the reason that we see people when we go out into their 70s and sometimes even into their early 80s working service industry jobs, Bruce, is because they have to. Mm-hmm. And in some ways, our contract with individuals in the United States, when we set up the Social Security program, and we said, if you work a life, if you pay into these programs, if you pay into Medicare through your payroll taxes, at some point you will be able to live and we can argue how we define this, but a comfortable retirement in which your basic needs are being met. That's no longer the case, my friend, and millions of Americans are struggling with this.
And it's not an entitlement program. We pay for it.
No, that is correct. We pay into we pay into the program over for the course of our life. A lot of people, and this is a misconception with Social Security, a lot of people think that when they retire, that there's a little account there set aside for themselves. That's not, of course, the way it works. You and I right now are paying for our parents' generation to receive those benefits, just as your children, Bruce, will pay for you to receive those benefits. So it's a program which pays into the future. And again, this is really about the fundamental social contract of the United States. We pay a minimal amount of our payroll taxes to help folks who have already been there where we're at in life. And then the expectation is at the end of the day that we will have something there for ourselves.
And it used to be, that our grandparents, they had a job and corporate America or the unions or whomever, provided for them in their life. It doesn't work that way anymore.
No, that's a fact of the matter. Right now, if you were to look back into the 60s and 70s, something we've talked about in this show, it was a very, very real expectation for me growing up. A personal anecdote. My dad worked for the Federal Bureau of Prisons. My mom was a homemaker. We had a small home growing up in Pennsylvania, 2 family cars, and they always found a way to take us on vacation every year. Basic needs met. Impossible today, Bruce. That is an impossible dream today to be able to have that kind of access to wealth. I think that a big chunk of my parents' first home was paid in cash that they saved. Mm-hmm. Bruce, try in this housing market to go out if you're a starting couple and pay cash or pay a large proportion of your mortgage down in cash. It's impossible. We live in a society today, unlike 40 or 50 years ago, where right now the current estimates are, when you, again, look at education debt, credit card debt, and mortgage debt, that the American consumer has $5.1 trillion right now of liabilities on the books, Bruce, just to keep up the lifestyle that we enjoyed 40 or 50 years ago in the United States. And to your point, that's why these seniors are returning to the workplace, because they're unable to make ends meet as they would have been back in the day, at a different time in the United States.
And it's interesting that you bring that up, because UNF just came out with a new poll about what concerns people here in Northeast Florida the most. And they did a poll, I think it was in 2023, and it was crime. And today, it's the housing crisis. They're worried about livability.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is. There's been a shift, and again, it's important to note, because I try to be honest with the viewers, that also is a partisan issue as well. We know that Republicans are more afraid of crime; they're more afraid of things like fentanyl at the southern border. Part of that is because of the media landscape that they listen to versus media landscape of what the Democrats listen to. But you're right. There has been a shift in that regard. The other thing here too, Bruce, is there is something to be said always for the politics of fear. I hate to, go back to like my textbook days and talk about authors that we may be familiar with, but Noam Chomsky, who wrote Manufacturing Consent in the 1980s.
You were going to bring that up.
I know, I'm sorry about that. But he always said that one of the biggest things for elected officials on either side, in order to maintain authority and in order to keep getting reelected, was to make somebody afraid of something.
Capitalize on that fear.
Capitalize on that fear. So from my childhood, of course, it was communism, then socialism, crime, illegal immigration, Islamophobia, Russophobia, xenophobia. There always has to be some sort of fear mechanism in order to really, Bruce, at least from my perspective, get Americans to accept what's happened to their pocketbooks in the last 40 to 50 years, also, my friend, of bipartisan leadership. This is not just a Republican frame, it's a Democratic frame as well.
Oh, no doubt. And each party frames it the way that benefits them.
Right, and I'm glad we're going to talk about that later on in the program, because Republicans will still contend that they're afraid of national debt. Meanwhile, they drive up the national debt with each budget.
Which takes us to the next question.
Right.
The big, beautiful bill. It would add trillions to the national debt. Florida's Rick Scott, okay, a Republican, one of 4 conservative members of the Senate who worries about getting blamed for the economic consequences of the budget reconciliation bill if it passes. Okay, so he says, I want to get a deal done. I support the president's agenda. He goes on to say, I support the border. I support the military. I support extending the Trump tax cuts. But we got to live in reality here. We got a financial crisis. You saw the Japanese bond market is in trouble. You saw the American bond market's in trouble. Inflation is not coming down. Interest is not coming down. That means we've got to balance the budget. And he and others, as well as economists, say the markets are looking for more fiscal discipline because yearly deficits of nearly $2 trillion are not sustainable. Is that a reality that will resonate in the Senate that did not in the House when it comes to dealing with this bill?
No. Not even in the least. I think that Senator Scott is out to lunch on this issue, to be quite frank with you, Bruce. First of all, I would say to any viewer out there who's watching this casually, who gives a hoot what is going on with the Japanese and American bond markets? Bond vigilantes, when it comes to actually paying, meeting the needs at somebody's kitchen table, their ability to buy a bond and then sell it back at a higher interest rate and make capital on that is the least of my concerns.
But even when he's talking about fiscal reality and balancing the budget?
Well, in balancing the budget, I mean, where is the uncertainty being created with that? All that is distress by people who already have money, not being able to sell bonds for a greater profit because the U.S. then has to come back and issue bonds at a higher interest rate because the markets somehow lose confidence.
But isn't he saying that the Japanese yen is in trouble and the Japanese, financial markets are in trouble, and the same thing can happen?
Well, he is, but my point is I don't think they're correlative. I don't think the entire argument is correlative to what's going on in the United States with a balanced budget. The other thing I would say to Senator Scott in this regard too is that if you look back through American history, and this isn't just me, and I unfortunately this isn't the kind of program where I can show a chart. Whenever the United States budget has been in balance in the past, it's been followed by either recession or depression historically.
Talking about the Clinton years.
Yeah, the Clinton years. That is correct, because everybody looks back to the fiscal prudence and discipline of Bill Clinton with his 3 balanced budgets in a row. And then we had a small recession in 2001, 2002 under Bush. And then we had the Great Recession in 2007 when the private markets accumulated so much debt because they were the ones who were expected to bear the burden for the federal government running surpluses, okay, that we ended up having a collapse in the economy. Now, one of the things that I would also say about Senator Scott in terms of his statement, he's kind of, in some ways, Bruce, an unreliable person in this regard. He is somebody who in the past has clearly shown, we know how many times he pleaded the fifth on Medicare fraud back when he owned a private company with Delta Insurance. I do not believe that he represents a majority of the Senate. I would like to say this, and this is not a program of economics, but when he saber rattles about the $37 trillion in debt the United States is in, I challenge anybody to really imagine a time in the future when their children or grandchildren's couches are going to be shaken for the change to pay back our national debt. That's not going to be happening. It's a political maneuver which really goes back to Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan in the late 1970s and early 1980s. You'll remember Thatcher made that famous statement, there is no such thing as public money, there's only taxpayer money. Well, Bruce, the last time I checked, it's not our faces printed on the currency, it's the United States dollar. It's Benjamin Franklin. Right. It is the government's money to issue. I think the last thing relative to this segment that I would say regarding this, my biggest fears always when it comes to government budgets is will our spending become inflationary? To Senator Scott's point, if you actually look at the inflation during the Trump administration, and I'm kind of loath in some ways to give Trump, it has come down. It has come down. But we need to also go back and look at what the causes of that inflation were. So much of it was attributed to the supply chain disasters that we had after COVID. It wasn't necessarily because the federal government was spending too much money into the economy. But I have to disclose this. It was a fact that when Americans were staying home and not traveling and not going on vacation, and they were still collecting their full paychecks. Well, Bruce, what is that? That is classic, inflation created by the fact that there was too much money sitting in the economy and not enough spending taking place in the economy. But to his credit, inflation has in a lot of sectors. We also just say like inflation as a whole. You have to look at the individual sectors within the economy. But in a lot of sectors of the economy, inflation's actually come down.
Right, and you also, people say that presidents influence the economy. The economy runs in cycles. That's a reality. And people also talk about inflation. A bigger issue is stagflation.
Yeah, well, sure. But I will say this, and I used to have that same thing, but I think the one thing that the Trump administration's taught us is that presidents can have an impact on the economy depending upon what they're threatening.
They can have a short-term impact.
A short-term. I mean, look at the tariffs. And by the way, one of the more amusing things, because this is politics and power that I've seen come out in the last couple of weeks, you've probably seen the acronym.
The TACO?
The TACO.
Which riles him.
Not because it's not made up by Democrats. It was never advanced by Democrats. It was advanced by who? Bond traders and people who are working on Wall Street. And again, if you're not familiar with the term, it was Trump always chickens out. You could literally at the press conference see Donald Trump seething when he realized that this was people. Because, I mean, this is why he kiboshed the tariffs in the first place, because he's reacting to what bond traders were saying about what it would do to their industry and what would it do to the creation of wealth within their sector, right? And it bothers them. It's really, really bothersome. And it's kind of funny when you look at the politics ends of things. People who are typically adjacent to Donald Trump were able to rile him up more than any Democrat could ever rile him up because of their use of that acronym.
Yeah, but you talk to Donald Trump, and he'll say, "Okay, so I put this on the table, and I'm going to put out this tariff. I'm going to raise it from 25 to 50%. It's the art of the deal. It's negotiation. It's basically his take."
Yeah, well, yeah, sure, but then here again, I put the
shiv. It does rile the market.
Right, but I put the shiv into you. You are in pain. I take the shiv out, and then expect you to thank me and say, "Oh, thank you, Daniel, for doing that for me."
But that's the narcissistic posturing for Donald Trump.
Yeah, right, and that is correct. And then I think the other thing, too, when we talk about the tariff talk and the impacts on the economy relative to this segment, there is no way that within one term of Donald Trump, even if he were completely successful, Bruce, that you are going to see the number of jobs repatriated to the United States that anybody would expect to be the output of this. And if those jobs were to be repatriated, and you talk to leaders in the industry, not just you and I and our opinions, they would tell you that the majority of these jobs, Bruce, will be automated. They're not going to be using American workers the same way that we did 40 or 50 years ago when you would turn on Laverne and Shirley and see them working in the bottle-making company.
Shlomo Shlomazel, Hassan Pfeffer Incorporated. That's a fact of AI.
Right, and by the way, I use that as an example because it's that kind of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania crowd that Donald Trump is trying to appeal to. But again, you would be looking at advanced machinery coming in, advanced technologies, robotic arms, other things, AI-generated jobs, which is something else, a great topic for a future show. Not for me, but I would have other people to talk to you about. Yeah. How will that impact the American workforce? I guarantee you, and I know, depending upon, how the age and the, of the audience, I think it's going to be very, very difficult for a lot of people to really get their minds wrapped around, Bruce, that by 2030, our workforce and the prevalence of AI is going to look very, very different 5 years now from it looks right now.
Right. The Rust Belt will never see the kind of manufacturing that it did before. The Tech Belt is what's going to benefit.
Right. And it becomes a question, and for another topic, what do we do with the Rust Belt? How do we transform the Rust Belt? Do we really invest in alternative forms of energy which are sustainable? How do we do that again? I mean, certainly at some point we have to recognize the fact that as a country and as a planet, we have to move off of existing technologies such as coal, fossil fuels, those things. And by the way, even if you're somebody who's like, Green New Deal guy or whatever the case may be, coal jobs are dirty, buddy. We know this. You've covered this in your life. People who have worked in the coal industry and the natural gas industry flat out have shorter life expectancies because of the type of work that they're performing. The average life expectancy of a coal miner, Bruce, in West Virginia to this day is something like 62 years old.
If that.
If that. So at what point do you want to move into a better quality job for individuals? And by the way, it doesn't have to be green tech. It could be warehousing. It could be a lot of other industries that we can find. And again, I want to use Republican language here because it's important, because I think it applies to everybody. That dignity of work that human beings do want, the satisfaction of being able to produce something at the end of the day and earn a paycheck.
Livable wage.
A livable wage which will sustain you and your family. That is an American value, Bruce. And that is something that these areas have really lost, that we're really getting away from.
Let me talk about Rand Paul, because Donald Trump basically
our favorite libertarian senator.
He said to Rand Paul, Donald Trump said to Rand Paul, you will vote for the bill. Well, Rand Paul won't vote for the House bill because of its provisions to raise the debt ceiling, and it will only make matters worse, he said. Spending cuts in the package are wimpy and anemic. They're also increasing spending. Others in the Senate see what's on the table as a joke. What remains to be seen is, will the Senate stall it or change it and use a budgeting tactic, which you called, talked about before, reconciliation, send it back to the House. And keep in mind, it was passed by only one vote, which you also talked about, among a divided Republican conference. Where do you think this goes from here?
Well, I think the first thing we're going to have to talk about is timeline. I know President Trump wanted to get this done by July 4th. I see that as being unlikely.
Oh, unrealistic.
However, it's also been suggested that the Congress will not adjourn in August until this is done because they don't want this to drag on to Labor Day. Relative to Senator Paul, I disagree with Senator Paul's economics, obviously. He's a libertarian. Senator Paul is still operating in an era where, in his mind, we are on a gold standard, which we haven't had a gold standard since the Nixon administration, where he believes every dollar spent has to be backed by gold, and he would definitely like to return to that. The one thing I would say, even though I disagree with Senator Paul, is that he's a principled libertarian in this regard. The people of Kentucky elected him knowing exactly what his beliefs were on this issue. So I think he's really kind of put himself into a pickle here, Bruce, because if he were to somehow go back against this thinking, he'd be really dumping a core ideological belief that he and his father, Ron, if you'll remember Ron Paul, who ran for President of the United States as a member of Congress, they've had this principle their entire life. And to his point, if you want to look at it through Rand Paul's lens, he's exactly correct. There's no real, I mean, you're reaching at a point, Bruce, where the only things in society that you can really touch in the United States if you want to reduce spending is in Social Security, Medicare, or the Pentagon. Right now, we have a Secretary of Defense who, for whatever reason, is out there bragging that we are going to have a Pentagon budget, a Pentagon, by the way, which has never passed an audit, of over $1 trillion, okay? So if you are Rand Paul and you're somebody who, again, is into diplomacy, who's into, having the United States active around the world, but asking questions like, why are all these firms in Northern Virginia, Honeywell, Northrop Grumman, why are all these guys who cannot pass an audit when they are literally, every time we've tried to audit them, missing tens of billions of dollars, Bruce? Why do we still have this, again, his language, faucet of taxpayer dollars still pouring into these firms? It's going to be, again, 53 to 47 in the Senate. Rand Paul is going to be one voice, but it's going to be very, very interesting to see where Senator Scott goes on that as well, because a lot of this, even though Scott's not a libertarian, he will enjoy or believes in a lot of the same ideological things that
now,
Rand Paul
to your point, The Guardian basically called, the House bill as it stands right now, trickle-up economics, sold as working-class salvation, and a shiny populist package hiding a brutal class agenda. Is that an accurate picture of what the bill as it stands right now is really all about?
Well, it could be, but here's the other thing, which is the reality. What is this bill? We're looking at, for middle-class folks and for lower-income folks, we're effectively looking at a continuation of Donald Trump's 2017 tax cuts. So you and I could sit here all day long, and we could accurately point out to your viewers or anybody using data and not things we've made up, how income inequality has grown since those 2017 tax cuts. But Bruce, here's the reality. There were also tax cuts for the middle-class and lower-class individuals. If the way the Republicans have structured this right now, if this bill were to not go through, lower class and middle class Americans would be experiencing a tax increase. Now, you could look at this and say, why don't you pass a bill which decreases tax cuts to the wealthy and keeps the same middle income or lower income tax cuts that we had from 17 and just creates more equity moving forward with the 2025 version? But here's the reality, Bruce. We know who the constituency is of the party. It's people with wealth. This is why, and I don't want to beat this up, this is why Senator Scott and others are so obsessed with Japanese and American bond markets, because these are the individuals who actually have access to capital and are actually influencing their re-election campaigns.
And have access to Donald Trump.
And have access to Donald Trump. That is correct. So the solution here, if you really wanted to do this, is the House GOP could soften or even deepen lower income tax cuts and middle income tax cuts. But they're not going to cut those tax cuts to the wealthy, which is where most of them rest. And then you're still going to have the problem with Senator Paul and Senator Scott, who are going to say, where are your real savings? And the reality is Donald Trump has said too many times, Medicare and Social Security off the table. We know that no administration today, including the Biden administration and Obama administration, for some reason, one of the things which really is amazing to me is that there's this fiction which goes around society that somehow Democrats decrease military spending. My friend, when was the last time you saw a Democratic president decrease military spending? It's been escalating for decades under the stewardship of both parties. But now that you're reaching a point where it's going to go over $1 trillion, and again, why is this a political third rail? Because most Americans will look at their son and daughter serving in the uniform. They'll consider cuts to the military, a cut to their own personal safety while they're deployed, when in the reality, most of that money is going to corporations, Bruce, who are selling arms abroad.
Yeah. I think the other thing that's a bit worrisome is what's buried in this bill. 1,116 pages. Things that raise alarms that have nothing to do with the budget or safety net programs or even debt. Something to do with the federal rule for civil court proceedings requiring anybody seeking an injunction or temporary restraining order to block an action by the Trump administration to post a financial bond. So, if you challenge Donald Trump, you will have to pay. In an article in USA Today, Erwin Chemerinsky, who's dean of the University of California, Berkeley School of Law, called that unprecedented. He said the greatest impact will be in preventing enforcement of all existing temporary restraining orders and preliminary injunctions if a bond has not been posted. Doesn't that go a bit far?
Well, for me, if you had a responsible U.S. Senate, this is a non-starter issue. That there's no way.
If you have a responsible U.S. Senate.
Yeah, but here's the issue, and this is why it should be concerning to everybody. Okay, this kind of power giveaway to the executive branch, where you're basically going to charge somebody in order to bring an injunction against the president of the United States. This may seem fantastic right now if you're a Donald Trump supporter, but I'm going to tell you what, there's an election in 3 years, and you're not going to be as enthusiastic about that when there's a Democrat in the White House again in 2028.
So basically what this is saying is you cannot call anything Donald Trump does into question.
That is correct.
Legally.
That is correct. But it's the same kind of political folly to me that when I advise my Democratic friends and they're like, well, let's increase the number of people in the Supreme Court so that we can get rid of Trump's political power within the court, and Comey Barrett and Kavanaugh and Gorsuch won't have as much political power as they do now. Start playing games with that stuff, and it's going to bite you in the future. And it's the same thing I would tell Republicans. If you think, if Trump supporters think this is a good idea, wait until the shoe is on the other foot. And then you've got Democrats wielding this kind of power in the same way. And when you're trying to question the actions of the executive, they're basically asking you for money in order to seek an injunction. It's a terrible idea. It's a terrible idea.
There needs to be a system of checks and balances. There needs to be an independent judiciary to make sure that the law is carried out without interference of politics. More to what's going on than meets the eye, in case you haven't figured that out. Look at the polarizing bill, compare it with Project 2025. That's the initiative coordinated by the Heritage Foundation with the goal of reshaping the federal government. Place the two agendas side by side. Your eyes will fly wide open, especially when you think about what the president said when he was campaigning for a second term in the White House. That and more when Politics and Power continues. Welcome back to Politics and Power. I'm Bruce Hamilton with political analyst Daniel Cronrath. So go back to his presidential campaign. Donald Trump said he knew nothing about Project 2025. Call it a coincidence if you want, but several of the executive orders he signed right after becoming president, it fit right in line with Project 2025. Look at his big, beautiful bill. Take a look at the agenda on health care, tax cuts, abortion, university endowments, and student loans. Despite President Trump's distancing himself from the Heritage Foundation initiative and claiming he knew nothing about what he said when he was on the campaign trail before winning back the White House, the initiatives line up like race cars at the starting line. Coincidence? No. Not my opinion. Look at it side by side for yourself. On the issue of health care, both plans look to change how Americans access public health care options. Already talked about the target on Medicaid. Daniel, when it comes to tax cuts, you have the Trump plan, which focuses on individual and business tax cuts. Look at Project 2025. It proposes substantial tax cuts for the wealthy and corporations. You think it's an accident that the proposals are virtually the same?
Well, Bruce, I want to try to give President Trump the benefit of the doubt as much as possible on this particular point. In a way which actually is probably going to sound a little bit insulting to the president. I don't know if he really did know what the contents were of Project 2025. I would doubt seriously if Trump was sitting at Mar-a-Lago in between golf games and going into people's weddings and sat there reading Project 2025's plan, okay? I will also tell you that I think that almost everything in Project 2025 are things that if you asked Trump, he would not disagree with, okay? I say this, I don't know how much Donald Trump is actually in on the preparation end of any kind of policy agenda. I'm sure he's involved with the politics, but Donald Trump likes to be popular. He likes to be popular within his inner circle. We know that unlike a lot of other politicians who we've discussed in the past, that being interpersonally popular is something that Trump very, very much values. I think, but to your point, and this is where I'm going to agree with you this, I don't think that Donald Trump questioning how people access health care, I don't think that Donald Trump questioning why can't people pay off their student loans and we need to get more aggressive with repayment, okay, regardless of their ability to pay. I don't think that Donald Trump saying he wants those student loan repayments to proceed without trying to substantively change the way that we fund higher education to begin with, okay? I think other things that you kind of left off a little bit, his ideological war, which is taking place on universities, particularly with Harvard. These are things which are also very, very much out of the Project 2025 playbook, kind of the decrease in intellectual freedom. The other big thing which I think Trump is fine with, as long as it doesn't interfere with Trump, is just kind of the quashing of any kind of public dissent, kind of going back to what you were saying before about the fiscal costs of seeking an injunction, all right? These are all things which are very, very much fitted with the Trump narrative and with the Trump mindset.
So maybe the people who lay the foundation for the GOP platform, they're the ones who ideologically set things forth, or very aware. Maybe the president himself.
My thought would be that the people who put together Project 2025 were putting together a vehicle tailored to Donald Trump. I do not think it was the other way around. So I don't think this was an ideological agenda of the president. I think that there are people at Cato, people at the Heritage Foundation, all kinds of K Street conservative firms who were looking for years, for decades, how they could implement various elements of this agenda. And they put together a package which would appeal to Donald Trump. They did it, and by the way, very, very skillfully. And if you're going to sell this, it's very, very easy for Donald Trump to go out in public and go, I don't know what Project 2025 is. Had he heard of it, I find that implausible. I'll be quite frank. That
he may have heard of it, doesn't know exactly what it's all about. So, all right. So,
that's my guess.
So I can buy into this, okay? And I'll tell you why. So I think it was just yesterday or the day before, somebody was talking about his Surgeon General, okay? And he finds out that the person who is now the Surgeon General isn't exactly medically qualified to be the Surgeon General. And he goes, so Bobby...
Went to medical school, but no medical license. They've never practiced medicine.
A PhD.
Right.
Or something.
Right.
And he goes, so, Bobby brings this person forward, and, she sounds like she's okay, and blah, 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 blah. And then I find out, maybe this isn't the right person for the job. We do know that Donald Trump, when he has somebody's ear and somebody's close to him, he kind of buys into what they're talking about.
Yeah.
So maybe that's what happened here?
Listen, this was one of the relevant things that we had talked about a while ago, the importance of him having Susie Wiles as his chief of staff. And please notice that it looks like Susie Wiles is still stable in her position.
Yes.
If you remember, and by the way, so is his press secretary, whose name I can't recall right now.
Levin.
Caroline Levin. If you look...
Who says some?
She says some whoppers, but listen, man, they haven't had the turnover. You haven't seen a Sean Spicer out there.
No.
Okay? You haven't you haven't seen a Scaramucci out there.
No.
Okay. You haven't seen the turnover yet within the White House's inner circle, right? This has been a lot more stable, a lot more aligned, and I think that there's a stability. I think we had talked a lot about would Trump be better prepared for his second term. And I think that both what we just talked about and Project 2025, whether you like the provisions or not, are very, very much a reflection of this. I think a lot of the times, Bruce, in 2016, and this isn't an insult, this is just the politics of the election cycle. In 2016, Donald Trump was the dog that caught the car. What do I do with it?
Yeah.
I've been chasing this, now I got it, no idea, don't know how to staff, who do I depend upon, what do I do, okay? In 2024, both himself and nobody was going to be unprepared for this. They were ready.
He put his staff in place much more quickly.
Much more quickly.
He's more efficient in carrying out his agenda than he was.
That is the one thing I would say about Donald Trump and the people who are surrounding him. Lessons learned. They did not walk in there unprepared. They had their agenda. The folks who had supported Trump before. I mean, listen, you remember this back in 2016 very, very closely. The majority of America, outside for a handful of people who legitimately predicted this, like the filmmaker Michael Moore, who's a big Democratic leftist, who was saying the whole time, Donald Trump's going to win. People laughed, chuckled, right?
Oh, yeah, he did.
He won, okay? And to that analogy, as I said before, now that you're the president, what do you do with it?
Yeah.
Okay? There was no questions this time what you do with it. The conservative DC think tanks, they gave him the policy proposal. They said, this is what we're going to do, Mr. President. This to your original question. They surrounded him with people who reinforced that kind of thought. By all acknowledgement, I mean, the key function, you learn this in a basic American federal government class, the key function of the White House Chief of Staff is to control the president's calendar. Who is the president meeting with and when? Okay? Some have even suggested that Pete Hegseth sold Donald Trump him being Secretary of Defense because he was able to sit beside him on a trip on Air Force One, that Susie Wiles was not aware of the fact that he was talking to him. Now, that could be complete fiction, but it would not be the kind of fiction that would surprise me at all after Donald Trump spent the last few years watching Pete Hegseth praise him on Fox and Friends.
News.
On Fox and Friends Saturday.
Yeah.
That is correct. Knowing his combat record, knowing everything that he said, that would not surprise me at all.
One thing you're right about, that this go round, Donald Trump is more resolute behind the Resolute desk, although I don't think the Resolute desk is in the Oval Office anymore. I think but it's storage, but something a little more ornate in there.
Well, the whole thing looks like a made-over Mar-a-Lago now when you look at it.
And he'll tell you.
Yeah.
When...
Yeah. So, somehow, pink and gold lame looks better than what the... I don't.
When Elon Musk was saying that he's going to go back to, working with his businesses again and kind of like spacing out and looking around, he goes, doesn't the Oval Office look fantastic now? All this gold and...
it's the ketamine.
Well, I'm not going there.
Yeah.
Both Trump's One Big Beautiful Bill and Project 2025 align in their efforts to restrict access to abortion services. Trump's plan prohibits Medicaid funds for Planned Parenthood. Project 2025 aims to restrict access to medication, abortion, student loans. Trump's proposal includes a tax on university endowments, which we've talked about. Maybe it's because the people who laid the foundation did that. Project 2025 aims to deny loans to states and in-state tuition to undocumented immigrants. Mm-hmm. Trump's plan also proposes an overhaul on repayment options. The president can distance himself all he wants from the Heritage Foundation's project on this issue, so the agendas are similar. They're barking up the same tree. I guess it doesn't really matter whether or not he knew about Project 2025 at this point, or how they got there. So let's get to the bottom line. Where does the Senate go on all of this? Do we get a reconciliation bill that goes back to the House? And in the end, does the American public have to worry about having its health care compromised and being saddled with crushing debt?
Well, let me just go back to the one thing you had said, and now I can't remember where you were at the beginning of the clip. Well, let me just answer the last part first. I'm not necessarily worried about the crushing debt. I'm certainly worried about people being able to have access to health care. The other thing is somebody who works with students for a living, and this will apply to both. Oh, this is the first comment. Let me retract that. A lot of the things that you were saying about the Heritage Foundation plan, you also need to remember, Bruce, are very popular with Donald Trump's base. There is a core out there that when you talk about Project 2025, we can't dismiss. Maybe it's 25%, maybe it's 30%, but there are people who actually like what's in Project 2025. And you and I can look at that and people who are more moderate or people who are more liberal on the political spectrum and can say, these are not good policies, these are harmful policies. But from the political element of it, there's a core which Donald Trump has in his ear who thinks that these policies are great, who think that Project 2025 was great. Even when we looked at public polling, which asked people about the project, okay? Even in the worst polls, there was still a quarter of the people who responded that they liked elements of this proposal. Because quite honestly, Bruce, think about it for a second. If you're an ideological conservative who liked the fact that Donald Trump produced pro-life judges to the Supreme Court and that he was able to return the issue of abortion to the states, you're probably going to like the fact that Project 2025 reduces abortion funding through Planned Parenthood and a lot of these other things. So that's what I'm talking about when I'm saying that there is a core element. One of my bigger concerns right now, because it affects everybody to a certain degree, is our kids. Is people who are out there with existing student loans or young borrowers who are going to be getting in the workforce. Every article that you've seen, which is written by experts, policy experts, and not people who are involved in the politics, student loans are being transitioned to the Small Business Administration. The Small Business Administration is woefully inequipped to manage the $1.7 trillion and millions of existing student loans that are out there in circulation, Bruce. It's going to be one of the most challenging things. And I think the other thing that I've told people who are upset, they're worried about what they're going to have to do, I am very, very skeptical of the ability of the SBA to actually turn this around and begin to collect payments efficiently. I can see nightmare scenarios with payments coming out being requested of borrowers where parents, Republican parents, are sitting around their table or Republican voters are being like, what is this bill? How did my income repayment plan, my income-based repayment plan become this figure? And it might not even be a result because that's a change in the program. It's just going to be a result of incompetency. Okay? Because you can't move from a system where you have the DOE and then you have all of the agencies out there like Mohila and others who are managing student loan debts, transfer all of that to an agency which is a tiny agency relative to the size of these other departments and expect efficiency. You just can't do it. And then the other thing I think that you were going to bring up in the slides too is the impact of DOGE throughout our government. This is going to be something that historians are going to be looking at that I will tell you with great confidence, despite the fact that I try to give President Trump the benefit of the doubt. These DOGE cuts, Bruce, are going to be disastrous through agencies like you've mentioned, like the National Institutes of Health, NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration. Do you realize each year, the National Weather Service, do you realize each year through preparation based on weather events, how much money the National Weather Services saves farmers, saves tourist industry folks, because they have an advance warning of what's going to be coming down? Huge cuts to the NWS.
What happens when you have the director of FEMA going, I don't even know we have a hurricane season?
I mean, you've got Ron DeSantis right now in our state budget putting back a very, very healthy and robust $12.4 billion reserves in the latest state budget. Hopefully your viewers realize, Bruce, that in a bat of an eyelash, one major hurricane is going to suck that dry, and we're going to be looking for FEMA to come in to bail us out, and there's not going to be any expertise, and there's not going to be any money in the program at all.
And we already know that the insurance industry here is hurting.
It's hurting, and this FEMA appointment reminds me, not to foreshadow a disaster, because I wouldn't want to do that, it reminds me perilously of the person we had in charge of FEMA before Katrina, the George W. Bush appointment, who had absolutely no idea how no clue how that agency ran whatsoever, because he was there as a political appointee, he was a nice fella, put in charge of an agency and had no idea what the functionality was of it at all. Very, very similar to me, by the way, of Linda McMahon recently, and I hate to poke a bear on the easy fruit. Well, not just that, but calling artificial intelligence A1, like it's a steak sauce. Like not even being aware of what artificial intelligence was as this Secretary of Education moves into a new era of education here in the United States, both at the secondary and post-secondary levels. So, the DOGE cuts, a lot of the staffing appointments, they give me great pause because you've got DOGE cuts on top of more cuts coming out of this regular budget.
Or the politician when asked about, the Medicaid cuts, well, we're all going to die.
Well, that was Joni Ernst from Iowa.
Right.
Yeah, and it was poorly timed, and then I think she said something after that to redeem herself.
She didn't take it back.
Well, she said something like, well, we're all going to die, but hopefully we're all children of Christ. That was her latest quote that she put out there. So, as a way basically to appease, I guess, some of her more conservative voters. Right. I mean, but yeah, man, it's going to be interesting, and a lot of these effects are not going to be, the way I look at it is this. The short-term pain in my mind is going to be the impacts of tariffs, whatever they may be. The fact that here in the next couple of months, you're going to see shipping containers not returning from China for goods. You're going to be in the back-to-school season and the Christmas season, and there's not going to be stuff to buy. Okay, that's concern number one.
We're all going to have to tighten our belts. We're already seeing. Donald Trump says that these countries absorb the tariffs. They don't. We're already seeing the impact, and it's going to be what it's going to be.
Well, countries don't. Yeah, these countries aren't paying for tariffs. That's just.
For those of you that relied on Shein and Temu or thought that, at the wholesale clubs or even Amazon, that they were going to absorb it. No, prices have already gone up. You brought up an interesting point, that there are some issues that politically, people are, they're citing. Immigration, abortion, and what have you. And that's an important lesson for I touched on this last week, for the Democrats to learn. Mm-hmm. They have to figure out where they're going to go with the midterms on the horizon. Mm-hmm. What's going to resonate with the American public, especially for the people who did not show up to the polls, which is why the Democrats lost. Not who voted, but who did not vote.
Yeah, yes.
Immigration's not a message for them. Abortion's not a message for them. The economy is a message for them because they failed miserably on messaging.
Right. Well, the messaging's bad. And here's the first thing relative to this. Who wants fentanyl coming into the United States?
Nobody. But it's not coming from Canada, so that's...
No, for sure. And that's, of course, still in the courts. It's still being challenged because he's usurping the powers of the presidency and imposing tariffs. And
immigration's not a battle for them because the American public largely is behind the immigration fight, though there are things that are happening. Like you have a high school student who was arrested, I forget where, because she was involved in a traffic stop and her dad was in the country illegally, and she's been here since she was 6, going to the same high school, and should have never been arrested, but...
Yep. Yeah. Well, the one thing that we've learned politically, Bruce, but first of all, these are all tragedies. The Republican Party and the conservative influence in the United States handles anecdotal examples and is able to spotlight them much more effectively than Democrats. The tragic death of that young woman in Georgia, Laken Riley, who they ended up passing an act about because she was killed by somebody who was here illegally, assaulted and sexually assaulted and killed, okay? That's a tragic death that made national news, okay? We have incidences all the time in the United States of people being forcibly removed and having their rights violated by ICE agents that the Democrats simply do not have the ability to capitalize on in the same way that the Republicans do semantically. It's a political gift. That's why I said when we began the program today, the Democrats could never have come up with language like taco. It came up organically from Trump supporters because the Democrats are either unable or unwilling to do that.
Or you have the terror incident in Boulder just this past weekend. Egyptian,
right.
Here illegally.
Right. And the other thing I would say about this is, too, and I think a lot of American people find this disingenuous. I find it disingenuous. Maybe you do, too. You can't have Hakeem Jeffries and Chuck Schumer and other individuals going out all day long and calling Donald Trump a fascist, and then in their very, very next breath saying things like, yeah, well, you know what we really need to do? Craft bipartisan legislation with the fascist. That makes no sense.
It's counterproductive.
It's counterproductive and makes no sense to the American people. You know, like, what are you basically saying?
It's immature.
Well, if you went into a physician and you said your arm hurt, and the Republican physician said, well, I'm going to cut it off at the shoulder, and they said, well, we were going to cut it off at the wrist. Well, let's agree on cutting it off at Bruce's elbow. That's bipartisan. I mean, that's nonsensical, but it's basically the same thing when you're conceding. The other side is an existential threat to the United States. Therefore, we must find a way to partner with the other side. How does that benefit you politically to even say or do something like that?
Bipartisan thinking, like in the days of Bob Dole, John McCain, and the ilk of those kind of politicians is long gone.
Well, because here's the issue: you have to have politicians who are actually willing to be bipartisan.
Listen to each other.
And listen to each other. And again, I would say that in the days when they used to linger in Washington and D.C., I know this
over a cup of coffee.
Over the cup of coffee. I know that this is unpopular with the American people, but the days that we used to have earmarks.
Yes.
And you would have Corinne Brown, a Democrat member from Congress here in Jacksonville, working with Republican colleagues on legislation that was bipartisan because Corinne may have had a pet project to bring back money to in her district to benefit her constituents. The elimination of earmarks, Bruce, I know that a lot of people are like, well, this is good, clean government. We're putting all the bills. It was also, relative to our politics, very, very... It ran down our politics because you really disincentivized the ability. I'll tell you what, a lot of people criticize Bernie Sanders for not introducing and passing a lot of freestanding legislation. You know what Sanders was a master of, both in the House and the Senate? Getting things for the state of Vermont in exchange for his vote. Working across the aisle and saying, these are programs which are important to me, which are important for folks in the Northeast, important for dairy farmers, and
benefiting the people.
Benefiting the people. And I'm going to be willing to come this far with you on your legislation if you're going to be willing to accept my rider, okay? And then having that work. Today, not there anymore, man. It's
all right,
gone.
I'm up against the clock because we could talk all day. Loaded question. Does Donald Trump understand or even care about the impact on the average American of everything that's going on?
I'm going to say yes, but I'm going to say to a limited degree, Bruce. I think that one thing Donald Trump, and I only know this from people who have known Donald Trump, who have met Donald Trump, who are not necessarily affluently wealthy, who have come into his orbit. There is an ability to empathize there and to know people and to recognize that people are struggling that I think that this president does have. Would that ability translate into any kind of meaningful policy that would help those people? That's where I become more skeptical, okay? Because at the end of the day, Bruce, and this isn't just a Donald Trump thing, this is a politician thing, there is no poor people's lobby in the United States, buddy. That is just the reality. There are no K Street lobbying firms sitting there trying to fight for people and scratch for people and trying to fight for people's human dignity. There are groups and interest groups that exist like that, but they don't have the money to Donald Trump. They don't have the access to Donald Trump. And by the way, at the same time, there is this lingering core ideological consistency with the GOP and conservatives that says, despite everything in our society which is stacked against you, despite the fact that we live in a country in which we have a form of elitist pluralism, where only the wealthy are able to get things passed, they still blame the individuals who are poor, Bruce, because they can't pull themselves up by their own bootstraps. And that is it's still the ideological elephant.
So I think, is the more important question, do the people who are meeting, discussing the bill in that very building care about the average American?
They do. I think they do. But it ends where their donor class tells them it's going to end, man. That's where it ends. It's going to end right there.
Because all they care about is their own reelection.
Well, they have to. Listen, the average member of Congress spends 25% of their day on the phone asking for more money. This is what I'm talking about. When I'm talking about an elite pluralist form of society, pluralism is the competition of ideas between competing groups for policy, but those policy debates are only taking place at the millionaire level and above in the United States. The needs and wants of you and I, the needs and wants of poor Republican voters are ignored in the United States for the plutocrats who are basically running our government. I know it sounds cynical. It's not what you learn and your kids are learning in their American federal government textbook. But the reality is those textbooks, or most of that thought, was formed before a time where citizens united and somebody's money being equated to free speech, and a system in which we can pump unlimited amount of monies into third-party groups to run ads. That is a day that even 20 years ago in America, I mean, you've been in journalism a long time, my friend. You remember the McCain-Feingold bill?
I do.
Bipartisan, trying to do this and trying to get money out of politics. And look where we stand today in 2025, my friend. I don't think that many of these members, I don't think that Aaron Bean, I don't think that John Rutherford, I don't think our local delegation, I'll say this to a person, is insensitive at all to the needs of regular people. But to the extent that they're actually going to do something with them, it's going to, I don't want to sound cynical, it's going to end very, very quickly, because you're not going to take on the class who fund you in order to enact those changes.
I think each and every one of those Congress people in the Senate and in the House need to go into what they presumably all carry in their coat pockets right there, take it out, the book that is the Constitution that they all claim to carry, and read those first words that says, "We the people," because that is who you're serving. Thank you, Daniel. And thank you for watching Politics and Power.
See why every day more people are choosing News4JAX, Northeast Florida and South Georgia's #1 source for local news.